The blood soaked through Sarah's nightgown in crimson ribbons while the mountain wind howled against the cabin walls, and Xavier Wolf knew with a dreadful certainty that his wife was dying in their bed with their newborn daughter cradled against her breast. He pressed his calloused hand against the wound that refused to stop bleeding, the wound that had opened during the difficult birth 3 hours ago, and watched helplessly as her face grew paler in the lamplight of their remote Wyoming cabin. The winter of 1872 had been brutal in the mountains above Medicine Bow, and the midwife, who lived 20 miles away, might as well have been in San Francisco for all the good she could do them now. "Xavier," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Her green eyes, which had sparkled with life and mischief when he first met her 5 years ago in Denver, now held a terrible knowledge. "I need you to listen to me." "Don't talk," he said roughly, his throat tight. "Save your strength. You'll be fine. You have to be fine." She shook her head slightly, and the movement seemed to cost her everything. The baby, their daughter Emma, made a small sound, and Sarah adjusted her arm with a mother's instinct that would not fade even as death approached. "I won't see tomorrow, and we both know it. Please, my love, let me say what I need to say." Xavier Wolf was not a man who cried. He had survived 3 years as a trapper in the Rockies, fought off a grizzly bear with nothing but a hunting knife, and carved out an existence in wilderness that killed lesser men. His shoulders were broad as an ox yoke, his arms thick with muscle earned from swinging an axe and hauling animal carcasses through mountain passes. His dark hair hung past his collar, and his hands were scarred from 100 different battles with nature. But now, holding his dying wife's hand, he felt tears burn hot trails down his bearded cheeks. "Don't leave me," he said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Don't leave us." "I don't want to," Sarah said, and her own tears slipped into her auburn hair. "God knows I want to stay. I want to watch Emma grow. I want to grow old with you in this cabin. But I can feel it, Xavier. I can feel myself slipping away." He pressed his forehead against hers, breathing in the familiar scent of her despite the copper smell of blood that filled the room. "What can I do? Tell me what to do." Sarah's hand, delicate and small in his massive grip, tightened with what little strength she had left. "In Medicine Bow, there's a woman named Julia Donovan. She works at the boarding house, helps Mrs. Henderson with the cooking and cleaning. Do you remember her?" Xavier searched his memory, thinking back to the handful of times they had gone down to Medicine Bow for supplies. He had a vague recollection of a young woman with dark hair and quiet eyes, someone who had been kind to Sarah when they stopped at Henderson's boarding house for a meal. "I think so. Why?" "She's all alone in the world," Sarah said, her breathing becoming more labored. "Her parents died 2 years ago of fever. She has no family, no prospects. She's kind and good and smart, Xavier. She deserves better than washing dishes and changing bed linens for the rest of her life." Sarah paused, gathering her strength. "And Emma needs a mother. You need a wife. I can't bear the thought of you alone up here, raising our daughter by yourself, grieving yourself into the grave." "Sarah, what are you saying?" Xavier pulled back to look at her face. "Promise me," Sarah said, her voice gaining an urgency that made fresh blood seep from the wound. "Promise me you'll marry her. Promise me you'll go to Medicine Bow and ask Julia Donovan to be your wife. Promise me you'll give Emma a mother and yourself a chance at happiness again." "I can't," Xavier said, shaking his head. "I can't promise that. I don't even know her, and I could never love anyone the way I love you." "You can," Sarah insisted, her grip tightening despite her weakness. "You will. Not the same way, perhaps, but love comes in different forms. Julia is good, Xavier. I saw it in her eyes, in the way she treated people. She's gentle and strong at the same time. She'll be good to Emma. She'll be good to you." Sarah's breathing hitched. "I can't rest, my love. I can't let go knowing that you'll be alone, that Emma will grow up without a mother's touch. Please, please promise me." Xavier looked down at his daughter, so small and helpless in her dying mother's arms. He thought about the years ahead, trying to raise her alone in this mountain cabin. He thought about the loneliness that already threatened to swallow him whole. He thought about Sarah, who had loved him enough to think of his future, even as her own slipped away. "I promise," he finally said, the words like stones in his mouth. "I promise I'll marry her. I'll take care of Emma, and I'll honor your wishes." Sarah's face relaxed, and something like peace settled over her features. "Thank you," she breathed. Thank you, my love. Take care of our girl. Tell her about me. Tell her I loved her with everything I had. Every day, Xavier said. I'll tell her every day. And Xavier? Sarah's voice was fading now, growing distant. Let yourself be happy. Don't punish yourself by grieving forever. I want you to live, truly live, not just survive. Promise me that too. I promise, he said again, though he could not imagine how he would keep such a promise. Sarah smiled then, a real smile that reminded him of the woman she had been. I love you, Xavier Wolf. I loved you from the moment you walked into my father's store in Denver and asked for supplies in that gruff way of yours. Thank you for 5 beautiful years. I love you, Xavier said, his voice breaking. I'll always love you. I know, Sarah whispered. She closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Take Emma now. Hold her for me. Xavier carefully lifted his daughter from Sarah's arms, cradling the tiny bundle against his broad chest. When he looked back at his wife, her eyes were still closed, but her lips moved in what might have been a prayer. He watched as the minutes stretched on, each breath coming further apart than the last, until finally, as the first gray light of dawn crept through the cabin window, Sarah breathed no more. The sound that came from Xavier Wolf was something between a howl and a sob, a primal expression of grief that echoed through the mountain valley. Emma began to cry, and he held her close, rocking her gently while his tears fell onto her blanket. Outside, the wind died down, as if nature itself was paying respect to the woman who had brought life and love to this harsh landscape. Xavier buried his wife 3 days later on a hillside overlooking their cabin, where wildflowers would bloom in the spring. He carved her name into a wooden cross with his own hands, each strike of the chisel an act of love and loss. Emma survived on goat's milk that he painstakingly fed her every few hours, and in those first terrible weeks, caring for his infant daughter was the only thing that kept him from walking into the wilderness and never coming back. As winter turned to a tentative spring in 1872, Xavier kept his promise to Sarah in his own way. He took Emma down from the mountains more frequently, making trips to Medicine Bow for supplies he could have done without. He told himself he was just checking on the town, making sure he had what he needed, but the truth was that he was looking for Julia Donovan. He found her on a warm April morning, hanging laundry behind Henderson's boarding house. She was exactly as Sarah had described, a woman of about 23 or 24, with dark brown hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes that held both sadness and strength. She wore a plain gray dress with an apron tied around her waist, and she moved with an efficiency that spoke of long practice at her work. Xavier approached with Emma in his arms, his heart pounding in a way it had not since he first courted Sarah. This felt wrong, disloyal somehow, even though he was keeping his dying wife's wish. He cleared his throat, and Julia turned at the sound. "Mr. Wolf?" she said, recognition crossing her face. "I heard about your wife. I'm so very sorry for your loss. Sarah was a lovely person." "Thank you," Xavier managed. Up close, he could see that Julia's eyes were brown with flecks of amber, and there were calluses on her hands from hard work. She looked tired but not defeated, weathered but not broken. "I wanted to talk to you if you have a moment." Julia glanced back at the boarding house, then nodded. "I have a few minutes before I need to start preparing lunch. Would you like to sit?" She gestured to a bench near the back door. They sat, and Xavier felt awkward and enormous next to her more delicate frame. Emma gurgled in his arms, and Julia's face softened as she looked at the baby. "She's beautiful," Julia said quietly. "She has Sarah's coloring, doesn't she? That lovely auburn hair." "Yes," Xavier said. He took a breath, trying to find the words. "Miss Donovan, I need to tell you something. Before Sarah died, she made me promise something. It's going to sound strange, and you have every right to refuse, but I gave her my word." Julia's brow furrowed slightly. "What kind of promise?" "She asked me to marry you," Xavier said bluntly, because he was not a man who knew how to dance around difficult subjects. "She said you were kind and good, and that Emma needed a mother. She made me swear I would come to Medicine Bow and ask for your hand." The color drained from Julia's face, and for a long moment she said nothing. Xavier watched emotions flicker across her features, shock, confusion, something that might have been hope, and then a careful blankness. "Mr. Wolf," she finally said, her voice measured, "that's quite possibly the strangest proposal I've ever heard, and I've heard some unusual ones working in a boarding house." "I know," Xavier said. "I'm not asking because I expect you to say yes. I'm asking because I promised Sarah, and I keep my promises. But I want to be clear about something. This wouldn't be a marriage of convenience. I wouldn't ask you to share my life and help raise my daughter and then treat you like a housekeeper. Sarah wanted me to truly marry you, to build a real life together." Julia stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. "Why would Sarah choose me? She barely knew me. She said she saw something in you, said you were alone in the world and deserved better, said you were kind and strong." Xavier stood as well, holding Emma against his shoulder. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Donovan. I loved my wife more than life itself, and part of me died with her. But I made her a promise, and another part of that promise was that I wouldn't just survive, I would try to live again. I don't know if I can do that, but I'm willing to try if you are." Julia turned to face him, searching his face with those amber-flecked eyes. "I don't know you, Mr. Wolf. You don't know me. How could we possibly make a marriage work?" "People have built marriages on less," Xavier said. "My parents had an arranged marriage, and they grew to love each other deeply. I'm not saying it would be easy. I'm not saying I can promise you romance and poetry, but I can promise you a home, security, respect, and an honest effort to make you happy. And in time, maybe we could find something real between us." "I need time to think," Julia said, but Xavier could see the conflict in her eyes. He knew she was weighing her limited options against this unexpected possibility. "Take all the time you need," Xavier said. "I'll be staying at the boarding house for a few days. When you've made your decision, let me know." Over the next 3 days, Xavier saw Julia frequently around the boarding house. He watched her work, saw how she treated the guests with patience and the other staff with kindness. He saw her slip extra food to a family who clearly had little money. He saw her stay late to help an elderly woman who had spilled tea all over herself. Everything Sarah had said about her seemed to be true. On the 4th day, Julia knocked on his door just after sunset. Xavier opened it to find her standing in the hallway, her hands clasped in front of her. "I have some questions," she said without preamble. "May I come in?" Xavier stepped aside, and Julia entered the small room. Emma was asleep in a makeshift cradle Xavier had fashioned from a drawer, and Julia glanced at the baby with a soft expression before turning her attention back to Xavier. If I agree to this," Julia began, "I need to know what my life would be like. Where do you live?" "I have a cabin in the mountains, about a day's ride from Medicine Bow," Xavier said. "It's remote and isolated, especially in winter. It's comfortable enough, but it's not fancy. I make my living trapping and hunting, selling furs and meat. It's a hard life, but it's honest work, and we would never go hungry." Julia nodded slowly. "Would I be expected to help with that work?" "You'd be expected to help run the household, same as Sarah did," Xavier said. "Cooking, cleaning, tending the garden we keep in summer, preserving food for winter. But I'd never ask you to do anything dangerous, and I'd help with whatever I could when I wasn't out on the trap lines." "And Emma?" Julia asked, glancing at the sleeping baby. "What would my role be with her?" "You'd be her mother," Xavier said simply. "Not in place of Sarah, but as her own person. I'd want you to love her and raise her as your own. I'd tell her about Sarah, keep her memory alive, but you would be the mother she knows and grows up with." Julia walked to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "What about us, Mr. Wolf? What would you expect from me as a wife?" Xavier felt heat creep up his neck, understanding her meaning. "I won't lie to you, Miss Donovan. I'd hope that in time we could have a full marriage in every sense, but I wouldn't force anything on you. We could take time to know each other first, let things develop naturally. I'm a patient man, and I meant what I said about respect." "My name is Julia," she said, still looking out the window. "If we're going to discuss marriage, you should call me Julia." "Julia," Xavier repeated, "and you can call me Xavier." She turned to face him then, and in the lamplight, her features seemed softer, more vulnerable. "I have nothing here, Xavier. Mrs. Henderson is kind, but this is not a life, not really. I'm 24 years old, and my prospects for marriage are essentially non-existent. Most men in Medicine Bow are looking for younger women or women with dowries. I wake up every day knowing that in 20 years, I'll probably still be changing bed linens and washing dishes, just older and more tired." "Then marry me," Xavier said quietly. "It may not be the romantic proposal you dreamed of as a girl, but I can offer you a real home, a family, and a chance at something more than what you have now." Julia was quiet for a long moment, and Xavier could see her turning the decision over in her mind. Finally, she took a deep breath and met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you, Xavier Wolf. God help us both. I'll marry you." They were wed a week later by the Methodist minister in Medicine Bow, with Mrs. Henderson and her husband serving as witnesses. Julia wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson insisted on giving her as a wedding gift, and Xavier wore the only clean shirt he owned. Emma slept through the entire ceremony in Julia's arms, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier placed a chaste kiss on Julia's cheek. The journey back to the mountain cabin took most of a day, and Xavier watched his new wife carefully as they traveled. Julia rode a gentle mare he had purchased for her, with Emma secured in a sling across her chest. She did not complain about the rough trail or the steep climbs, but he saw her eyes widen when they finally reached the cabin, and she realized just how remote their home truly was. "It's very isolated," she said, dismounting with his help. Yes," Xavier agreed. "The nearest neighbor is 15 miles away. In winter, we can go weeks without seeing another soul. Is that going to be a problem?" Julia looked around at the towering pines, the mountain peaks still capped with snow, the vast emptiness that surrounded them. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me again in a few months." That first month was awkward and strange for both of them. Xavier had given Julia the bedroom, insisting he would sleep in the main room by the fire. They moved around each other carefully, politely, like two people learning a complicated dance. But slowly, gradually, they began to find a rhythm. Julia proved to be remarkably capable. She took to caring for Emma with a natural tenderness that made Xavier's chest ache with gratitude. She reorganized the cabin with an efficiency that improved their daily life in a dozen small ways. She was an excellent cook, turning his simple provisions into meals that reminded him there was still pleasure to be found in living. For his part, Xavier tried to make her life easier in any way he could. He built her a better workspace in the kitchen. He brought her wildflowers from the meadows. He took over Emma's nighttime feedings whenever he was home, insisting that Julia needed her rest. He told her about the mountains, teaching her which plants were edible, which animals were dangerous, how to read the weather in the clouds. They talked, tentatively at first and then more freely. Xavier told her about his childhood in Missouri, about how he had come west after both his parents died of cholera, seeking a new start in the territories. Julia told him about growing up in Medicine Bow, about her parents who had run a small dry goods store until fever took them both within days of each other. They shared their griefs and their fears, their hopes and their memories. One evening in late June, as they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Julia spoke softly. "I think I'm starting to understand why Sarah chose me." Xavier looked at her, noting how the fading light caught in her dark hair. "Why's that?" "Because we're both alone," Julia said. "Both of us lost the people we loved most. She knew we could understand each other in ways that others might not. She knew we could build something together out of our shared losses." "Sarah was always smarter than me," Xavier said, a hint of his old pain in his voice. "You still love her," Julia said. It was not a question. "I do," Xavier admitted. "I probably always will, in some way. Does that bother you?" Julia shook her head. "No. I think I'd be more concerned if you had forgotten her so quickly. Love doesn't just disappear because someone dies. It changes shape, but it doesn't vanish." She paused. "I loved someone once, you know, before my parents died. His name was Thomas, and he was a clerk at the bank. We were planning to marry, but when my parents passed and I lost everything, he decided he'd rather marry the bank president's daughter instead." "He was a fool," Xavier said with conviction. Julia laughed, a sound Xavier had come to cherish. "Maybe. Or maybe he was just practical. Either way, I learned that love alone isn't always enough. Sometimes you need commitment, loyalty, shared purpose. Those things matter just as much." "Do you think we have those things?" Xavier asked. "I think we're building them," Julia said. "Slowly, but yes, I think we are." In July, Xavier had to make a week-long trip to check his trap lines and set new ones for the coming season. He hated leaving Julia and Emma alone, but Julia insisted she would be fine. He left her with his rifle, made sure she had plenty of supplies, and gave her detailed instructions on what to do in various emergencies. When he returned, tired and dirty from a week in the wilderness, he found the cabin filled with the smell of baking bread and Julia singing softly to Emma. The sight of them, his wife and daughter in the warm lamplight, hit him with unexpected force. This was his family now. This was his home. And for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something other than grief and obligation. Julia looked up when he entered, and her face brightened with genuine pleasure. "You're back. I was starting to worry." "Took longer than I expected," Xavier said, setting down his pack. "How was everything here?" "We managed just fine," Julia said with a smile. "Emma missed you, though. Watch." She held the baby up, and Emma's face broke into a gummy smile when she saw Xavier. "See? She knows her papa." Xavier crossed the room and took his daughter gently, holding her up to look at her. "Did you behave for Julia?" "She was an angel," Julia said. "Well, mostly. We had one very fussy night, but we got through it together, didn't we, sweet girl?" Xavier noticed the dark circles under Julia's eyes and felt a surge of appreciation for this woman who had stepped into such a difficult role. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for taking care of her, for taking care of everything." "That's what family does," Julia said simply, and the word family settled between them like a promise. August brought scorching heat to the mountains, and with it, a crisis. Xavier was working outside chopping wood for their winter stores when he heard Julia cry out from inside the cabin. He dropped the axe and ran inside to find Emma burning with fever, her little face flushed and her breathing labored. "She just suddenly got hot," Julia said, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know what's wrong." Xavier examined his daughter with hands that tried not to shake. He had seen fever take too many people, including Julia's parents and his own. The helplessness he felt was crushing, but he forced himself to think clearly. "We need to bring the fever down," he said. "Cool water, but not too cold. Can you wet some cloths while I undress her?" For the next 2 days and nights, Xavier and Julia worked together in a desperate battle against Emma's fever. They took turns holding her, bathing her with cool cloths, trying to get her to take water. They barely slept, barely ate. Their entire world narrowed to the tiny life that hung in the balance. On the second night, as Emma's fever finally began to break, Julia collapsed against Xavier's shoulder and wept. He held her awkwardly at first, then more firmly, feeling her fear and relief shake through her small frame. "I thought we were going to lose her," Julia sobbed. "I was so scared, Xavier. I couldn't bear it if we lost her." "I know," Xavier said, his own voice rough with emotion. "I know, but she's going to be all right. We saved her, Julia. Together, we saved her." Julia pulled back to look at him, her face wet with tears. "I love her, Xavier. I know I've only been her mother for a few months, but I love her as if I'd given birth to her myself." "She's lucky to have you," Xavier said, and he meant it with everything in him. He reached up and gently wiped the tears from Julia's cheeks, and something shifted between them in that moment. The careful distance they had maintained began to crumble, replaced by something warmer and more real. "Xavier," Julia whispered, and he leaned down and kissed her. It was not like the chaste kiss from their wedding day. This was a real kiss, full of emotion and promise, and the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. When they pulled apart, Julia's eyes were wide, but she was smiling. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again," she admitted. "Neither did I," Xavier said. He cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. "I can't promise I'll be easy to live with. I'm rough around the edges, and I'm probably going to make mistakes. But I can promise that I'll try my best to make you happy, Julia. You've become important to me, more important than I realized until just now." "I feel the same way," Julia said. She placed her hand over his. "Sarah was right. We could build something real together. I think we already have." That night, after Emma was sleeping peacefully, Julia came to Xavier's makeshift bed by the fire. She did not say anything, just took his hand and led him to the bedroom, to the bed he had given up for her. And in the quiet darkness of their mountain cabin, with the stars bright through the window, they became husband and wife in truth. the seasons turned, and with them, Xavier and Julia's marriage deepened and grew. The careful friendship they had built became love, different from what Xavier had felt for Sarah, but no less real and no less powerful. Julia became the center of his world, her laughter a sound he sought like a man seeking water in a desert, her touch something he craved like warmth in winter. By the time Emma celebrated her first birthday in the winter of 1873, Julia was pregnant with their own child. Xavier was terrified, remembering Sarah's death, but Julia was calm and confident. "I'm strong," she told him when he voiced his fears, "and we'll go to Medicine Bow a month before my time. Mrs. Henderson has offered us a room, and the midwife will be close by." "I'll be fine, Xavier. We'll be fine." She was right. In May of 1874, Julia gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named Jacob, and Xavier wept with relief and joy as he held his son for the first time. Emma, now a precocious 2-year-old, was fascinated by her new brother and insisted on helping with everything. Life settled into a new rhythm, busy and full and rich in ways Xavier had never imagined. The cabin rang with children's laughter and Julia's singing. The traplines brought in good money, and Xavier used it to improve their home and their life. He built an addition to the cabin, giving them more space. He bought Julia a good stove that made her cooking easier. He purchased books for Emma, already seeing his daughter's quick mind and hunger for learning. On a fall evening in 1876, as Xavier sat on the porch with Emma reading from a primer while Julia nursed their second son Samuel inside, he thought about the promise he had made to Sarah 4 years earlier. At the time, it had seemed impossible, a burden he would carry out of obligation and guilt. But Sarah had seen something he could not see in his grief. She had given him a gift, though it had taken him time to recognize it. "Papa, what does this word say?" Emma asked, pointing to a word in her book. "Sound it out," Xavier encouraged. "What letter does it start with?" Emma studied the word, her face screwed up in concentration. She had Sarah's auburn hair and green eyes, but her determination was all her own. "Forever." "Forever?" "That's right, sweetheart. Forever. Do you know what that means?" "It means for always and always," Emma said confidently. "Like how you love me forever." "Exactly like that," Xavier said, pulling her close. "I love you forever." Julia came out onto the porch, Samuel sleeping against her shoulder. She settled into the chair next to Xavier, and he reached over to take her hand. This was his family, built from loss and promise and a dying woman's wisdom. This was his forever. "What are you thinking about?" Julia asked, seeing the expression on his face. "About Sarah," Xavier admitted. "About the promise she made me make. I was so angry at her at first for making me swear to marry someone I didn't know. It felt like she was trying to replace herself, and I couldn't understand it." Julia squeezed his hand. "And now?" "Now I understand that she loved me enough to see past her own death," Xavier said. "She knew I would need someone, that Emma would need someone. And somehow she knew that you and I could find happiness together. She gave me you, Julia. It was the last gift she had to give, and it might have been the greatest." "I think of her too," Julia said softly. "I thank her, in my own way. She brought me here, gave me this life, this family. I hope she knows that I'll always take care of them, that I'll always honor what she did." Emma looked up from her book, following the conversation with the seriousness that sometimes overtook her young face. "Papa, tell me about my mama Sarah." Xavier had told this story many times, and he would tell it many more. "Your mama Sarah was beautiful and brave," he began. "She had red hair like you and eyes as green as spring grass. She loved your papa very much, and when you were born, she loved you with her whole heart. She knew she was going to heaven, and her very last words were about making sure you would be taken care of. She asked me to marry Julia, to give you a mother who would love you and raise you well." "Did she know Julia?" Emma asked. "Only a little," Xavier said. "But your mama Sarah was very wise, and she knew Julia was special. She was right, wasn't she?" Emma looked at Julia with solemn eyes. "I love you, Mama Julia." "And I love you, sweet girl," Julia said, her eyes bright with tears. "Your mama Sarah gave me the greatest gift when she trusted me with you. I think about her every day, and I try to be the mother she wanted you to have." "Can someone have two mamas?" Emma asked. "Ours? Bihmo." Yes, Xavier said firmly. You have Mama Sarah, who loved you first and watches over you from heaven. And you have Mama Julia, who loves you now and will always be here for you. Both of them are your mother in different ways. Emma seemed satisfied with this answer and went back to her book. Xavier and Julia sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains, their children safe and warm, their life together everything neither of them had dared to hope for. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and milestones. In 1878, Julia gave birth to twin girls, Ruth and Rebecca, and the cabin became even more crowded and chaotic and wonderful. Xavier built another addition, creating bedrooms for the children so he and Julia could have privacy. Emma grew into a thoughtful, intelligent girl who loved books and asked endless questions about everything. Jacob was adventurous and bold, already following his father into the woods to learn tracking and hunting. Samuel was gentle and artistic, preferring to draw pictures of the animals rather than hunt them. The traplines continued to provide well, and Xavier's reputation as a fair trader and skilled mountaineer grew throughout the territory. He made trips to Medicine Bow and other settlements, always bringing back supplies and news for Julia and the children. But he always hurried home, eager to return to the family that had become his reason for living. In the spring of 1880, Xavier took Emma, now 8 years old, up to the hillside where Sarah was buried. The wooden cross he had carved 8 years earlier was weathered but still standing, and wildflowers bloomed all around the grave just as he'd imagined they would. "Is this where Mama Sarah is?" Emma asked, her voice quiet with respect. "This is where her body rests," Xavier said, "but I think her spirit is everywhere in these mountains, watching over us." Emma knelt down and placed the flowers she had picked on the grave. "Thank you, Mama Sarah," she said simply. "Thank you for giving me Papa and Mama Julia and my brothers and sisters. Thank you for loving me, even though you had to go to heaven." Xavier felt his throat tighten with emotion. "She would be so proud of you, Emma. You're growing into such a fine young lady." "Do you still miss her, Papa?" Emma asked. "I do," Xavier said honestly. "Not in the same way I did at first, when the pain was so fresh I could barely breathe. Now it's more like a sweet sadness, remembering something beautiful that was part of my life. But I also have Mama Julia now, and I love her very much. Both things can be true at the same time." Emma nodded, understanding in her own way. "I'm glad Mama Sarah told you to marry Mama Julia. I can't imagine life without her." "Neither can I, sweetheart," Xavier said. "Neither can I." That evening, after the children were in bed, Xavier told Julia about the conversation. They lay together in their bed, Julia's head on his chest, his arms around her in a position that had become as natural as breathing. "I went up there yesterday," Julia admitted. "I wanted to tidy the grave, make sure it looked nice. I do that sometimes, talk to her. I hope that doesn't seem strange." "Not strange at all," Xavier said, kissing the top of her head. "What do you talk to her about?" "The children, mostly," Julia said. "I tell her how they're growing, what they're learning. I tell her about Emma's love of books and Jacob's fearlessness and Samuel's kind heart. I tell her about Ruth and Rebecca's personalities starting to show. And I thank her, Xavier. I thank her for trusting me with her family, for giving me the chance to have this life." "I love you," Xavier said, the words coming easily after all these years. "I love you so much, Julia. You've made me happier than I ever thought I could be again." Julia lifted her head to look at him, her face soft in the lamplight. "You've given me everything, Xavier. A home, a family, a purpose, love. I never thought I'd have any of those things, and now I have them all because of a promise you made to a dying woman." "Best promise I ever made," Xavier said, pulling her close. "Even when I didn't understand it, even when it felt impossible. Best promise I ever made." The children grew, and the world changed around them. Wyoming became a state, bringing law and order to what had once been wild territory. The railroad expanded, making travel easier. More settlers arrived, filling in the spaces that had once been empty wilderness. But through all the changes, Xavier and Julia's mountain home remained a constant, a place of love and security and family. In 1885, when Emma was 13, a schoolteacher came to Medicine Bow and opened a proper school. Xavier and Julia discussed it seriously, weighing Emma's education against the difficulty of the journey. "I want to go," Emma said when they asked her opinion. I love learning, Papa. I want to study properly, learn everything I can. So arrangements were made for Emma to board with the Hendersons during the school term, coming home to the mountain on weekends and for holidays. It was hard for Xavier, watching his daughter grow up and away from him, but Julia reminded him that this was what parents did. They raised their children to be independent, to make their own way in the world. She'll always come back, Julia said. This will always be her home. Julia was right. Emma thrived in school but counted the days until she could return to the mountain. And when she did come home, she brought her learning with her, teaching her younger siblings and filling the cabin with discussions of history and mathematics and literature. Jacob and Samuel followed their sister to school when they were old enough, though Jacob was less enthusiastic about academics, and Samuel took to it like a duck to water. The twins, Ruth and Rebecca, were still young but already showing signs of the intelligence that ran through the family. In 1888, Xavier and Julia celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary. Xavier had become grayer at the temples, his face lined from years in the sun and wind, but his strength had not diminished. Julia had filled out from the thin young woman she had been, her body shaped by bearing children and hard work, but Xavier thought she was more beautiful than ever. They sat on their porch, which had become something of a tradition on special occasions, watching the stars come out over the mountains. The children were all inside, the older ones supervising the younger, giving their parents rare privacy. 16 years, Julia said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like it's gone by in a moment. Do you have any regrets? Xavier asked, though he was not sure he wanted to hear the answer. Julia turned to look at him, her expression serious. Not a single one. This life, this family, it's more than I ever dreamed of having. What about you? Do you regret following through on Sarah's request? Never, Xavier said firmly. I regretted it at first, in those early days when everything felt wrong and forced. But now I can see that Sarah gave me a second chance at happiness, and you made that chance real. I'm grateful every day that she knew you, that she saw in you what I would come to see, that she loved me enough to make sure I wouldn't spend my life alone and grieving. We've been blessed, Julia said simply. Not everyone gets the life we have. No, Xavier agreed. They don't. A shooting star streaked across the sky, and they both made silent wishes. Xavier's wish, as it had been for years now, was simple. That his family would continue to be healthy and happy, that his children would grow into good people, that Julia would remain by his side for the rest of his days. He suspected Julia's wish was similar. Inside, they heard laughter and the sound of the twins singing a song Emma had taught them. It was the sound of home, of family, of a promise kept and a life well lived. As the years turned toward a new decade, the family continued to flourish. Emma, now a young woman of 18, had finished her schooling and taken a position as an assistant teacher in Medicine Bow. She was courted by several young men, but she was particular, looking for someone who met the standard her father had set. Jacob, at 16, was already as big as Xavier had been at 20, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer. He had inherited his father's love of the wilderness and spent weeks at a time on the trap lines, learning the trade that had sustained their family for so long. Samuel, at 14, was gentler than his brother, but no less capable. He had a talent for mechanics and invention, always tinkering with things to make them work better. Xavier did not fully understand his son's passion for gears and springs, but he supported it nonetheless. Ruth and Rebecca, now 10 years old, were inseparable and as wild as colts. They could track and shoot almost as well as their brothers, climbed trees like squirrels, and gave Julia daily heart attacks with their fearlessness. But they were also tender-hearted, caring for injured animals and comforting their younger siblings. Because yes, there were younger siblings. Julia had given birth to 2 more children in the years that followed, Daniel in 1882 and Sarah in 1886. Sarah was named in honor of Xavier's first wife, with Julia's blessing. It felt right to have a Sarah in the family again, to speak that name with love and happiness rather than grief. In the spring of 1891, Emma came home with news. She had met someone, a young lawyer named Thomas Wheeler, who had opened a practice in Medicine Bow. He was educated and kind and ambitious, and Emma was clearly smitten. "I'd like you to meet him, Papa," Emma said, her cheeks flushed with excitement. I think you'll approve. If he makes you happy and treats you with respect, I'll approve, Xavier said gruffly, though inside his heart was breaking a little. His daughter, the baby Sarah had died bringing into the world, was grown up and ready to start her own life. Thomas Wheeler turned out to be a decent man, perhaps a bit soft for Xavier's taste, but clearly devoted to Emma. Xavier gave his blessing, and in June of 1891, Emma was married in a ceremony that brought together people from all over the county. Julia wept through the entire service, and Xavier had to blink away his own tears more than once. After the guests had left and the celebration was over, Xavier stood on the hillside where Sarah was buried. He came here less frequently now, the sharp edge of grief long since dulled to a bittersweet memory. But today felt like a day that required her presence. "Our daughter got married today," he said to the weathered headstone. "Emma. She's grown into an amazing woman, Sarah. Smart and kind and strong, just like you were. She's going to have a good life with Thomas. I think you'd approve." He paused. "I kept my promise to you. I married Julia, and together we raised Emma and gave her siblings and built a family. And you were right, Sarah. You were right about everything. Julia was exactly who we needed. She became the heart of this family, and I love her more than I can say. I hope you know that. I hope you're not hurt by it. I think you'd be happy seeing what we've built." The wind rustled through the wildflowers, and Xavier chose to take it as Sarah's answer. He stood there for a long time, remembering the woman who had loved him enough to plan for his future even as she faced her death. Then he walked down the hill to where Julia was waiting, his present and his future, the woman who had fulfilled a promise and become so much more. The 20th century arrived, bringing with it changes that Xavier could never have imagined as a young mountain man. The telephone reached Medicine Bow, and automobiles became a common sight. The wild frontier of his youth was disappearing, replaced by civilization and progress. But in the mountains, life continued much as it always had. Xavier was in his 50s now, his hair more silver than dark, his face deeply lined by decades of mountain weather. His body was still strong, though he felt his age in ways he had not before. But he still ran his traplines, still provided for his family, still rose before dawn to split wood and haul water. Julia had aged gracefully, her dark hair streaked with gray, her figure matronly. The years had been kind to her, and Xavier thought she was more beautiful at 46 than she had been at 24. She still ran their household with quiet efficiency, still sang while she worked, still made their cabin a home filled with warmth and love. Their children were growing up and making their own ways in the world. Emma and Thomas had given them 3 grandchildren, and nothing filled Xavier's heart quite like holding his grandchildren and telling them stories of the old days. Jacob had married a girl from Medicine Bow and was establishing his own trapping territory further north. Samuel had moved to Cheyenne to work with a company that manufactured agricultural equipment. Ruth and Rebecca, now young women of 20, still lived at home but were being courted by various young men. Daniel, 18, was working as a ranch hand and learning the cattle business, and little Sarah, just 14, was the baby of the family, still in school and full of dreams about the future. On a cold evening in January 1901, Xavier and Julia sat by their fire, alone in the cabin for a rare moment of peace. The house felt too quiet without children running through it, but Xavier had to admit that this stage of life had its own pleasures. "Do you remember when I first brought you here?" Xavier asked, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "You looked around at all this wilderness, and I could see you wondering what you'd gotten yourself into." Julia laughed, a sound that still made his heart lift. "I was terrified. I'd never been anywhere so isolated, so far from civilization. I thought I might go mad from the loneliness." "But you didn't," Xavier said. "No," Julia agreed, "because I had you, and I had Emma, and soon I had this whole family to fill the silence. The isolation that seemed so frightening became a gift. We built our own world up here, away from everything else. We made our own happiness." Xavier reached over and took her hand, his large, scarred fingers entwining with her smaller, softer ones. "I need to tell you something, Julia. Something I should have said more often over the years." "What's that?" Julia asked, turning to look at him. Thank you," Xavier said simply. Thank you for saying yes when I made that strange proposal. Thank you for coming to this mountain and making it a home. Thank you for loving Emma as your own. Thank you for giving me more children, for being my partner in everything, for loving me even when I was difficult or distant or too wrapped up in grief to see what was right in front of me. Thank you for making Sarah's dying wish come true in ways that neither of us could have imagined at the time. Julia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. You don't need to thank me, Xavier. You gave me just as much as I gave you. You gave me a purpose, a home, a family. You gave me love when I thought I'd never have it. You made me a mother and a wife and a partner. Everything good in my life came from that day you walked up to me at the boarding house and told me about Sarah's promise. We were both lucky, Xavier said. Lucky that Sarah was wise enough to see what we needed. Lucky that we were brave enough to take a chance on each other. Lucky that we found love in such an unlikely place. Not luck, Julia said firmly. Grace. We were given grace, Xavier. Sarah's grace in her dying moments, God's grace in bringing us together, our own grace in being willing to open our hearts again after loss. Grace and love, that's what built this family. Xavier pulled Julia close, holding her in his arms the way he had held her thousands of times over the years. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her body warm and familiar. This, he thought, was what forever felt like. Not the dramatic passion of first love, though they had that too, but this comfortable, deep, abiding affection that came from building a life together, day by day, year by year. I love you, Julia Wolf, Xavier said into her hair. For the rest of my days and beyond, I love you. And I love you, Julia said, always and forever. They sat there by the fire, two people who had found each other through the most unusual circumstances and built something beautiful together. Outside, the mountain wind howled and the stars wheeled across the sky. Inside, the fire crackled and the cabin held the warmth of decades of love and family. Xavier thought about Sarah, as he often did, and sent a silent prayer of gratitude to her. She had loved him enough to let him go, to push him toward a future she would never see. She had loved Emma enough to ensure her daughter would have a mother's care. And she had possessed wisdom beyond her years to see that Xavier and Julia could heal each other's loneliness and build something lasting. He had kept his promise. He had married Julia, raised Emma, built a family, and found love again. But more than that, he had honored the spirit of Sarah's final wish. He had chosen to live rather than merely survive. He had opened his heart to happiness even when grief threatened to swallow him whole. He had taken a dying woman's words and turned them into a life worth living. Years continued to pass in the way that years do, each one marked by its own joys and sorrows. Xavier and Julia grew older together, their bodies slowing but their minds and hearts still sharp. They became grandparents many times over, and eventually great-grandparents, their legacy spreading out through Wyoming and beyond. Emma and Thomas had a happy marriage and raised fine children who carried on the traditions of both families. Jacob's trapping business thrived, and he taught his own sons the skills Xavier had taught him. Samuel's inventions brought him some measure of fame, and he never forgot his mountain upbringing. Ruth married a rancher and became a formidable ranchwoman in her own right. Rebecca married a teacher and opened her own school. Daniel took over the family trap lines when Xavier could no longer manage them. And little Sarah grew into a doctor, the first in the family to pursue such an ambitious education. In the summer of 1915, the Wolf family gathered at the mountain cabin for a reunion. Children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren filled the house and spilled out into the yard. There was food and laughter and music, stories told and memories shared. Xavier, now in his mid-60s, sat in a chair of honor on the porch and watched his family with pride and wonder. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Julia asked, sitting beside him. She was 61 now, her hair completely white, her face deeply lined. But to Xavier, she was still the most beautiful woman in the world. "Never," Xavier admitted. "When Sarah died, I thought my life was over. I thought the best I could hope for was to raise Emma and survive each day. I never imagined I could be this happy again, that I could have all of this." He gestured to the crowd of people, all of them connected to him and Julia through blood or marriage. Sarah knew, Julia said softly. Somehow she knew. She saw the future in a way we couldn't, and she made sure you would be part of it. We would be part of it, Xavier corrected. She brought us together, Julia. That was her gift to both of us. Emma approached them, a grandmother herself now, her auburn hair streaked with gray. She was still beautiful, still carrying the best of Sarah in her features and the best of Xavier in her strength. Papa, everyone wants you to say something, will you? Xavier stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement but his spirit willing. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the family that had grown from loss and promise and love. He cleared his throat, suddenly emotional in a way that caught him off guard. I'm not a man of many words, he began, and several people laughed because this was well known. But I want to say something about how we all came to be here today. This family started with love, the love I had for my first wife, Sarah. She gave me Emma, and then she gave me something else, a command to keep living, to find love again, to build a future. She made me promise to marry a woman I barely knew. And that promise seemed impossible at the time. He reached down and took Julia's hand. But I kept that promise, and that woman became my wife, my partner, the love of my life. Together, Julia and I raised Emma and had more children, and those children had children, and now there are 3 generations of family here today. Every single one of you exists because a dying woman loved enough to plan for the future, and because 2 lonely people were brave enough to take a chance on each other. Xavier's voice grew thick with emotion. I'm old now, and I know my time is growing short, but I want you all to know that I've lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and family and purpose. I want you to remember that love doesn't end with death, it transforms. Sarah's love for me transformed into this family. My love for Julia has transformed into all of you, and when I'm gone, my love will continue in the ways you live your lives and treat each other. He paused, looking at each face in turn. Remember where you come from. Remember the sacrifices that were made for you to be here. Remember that family is everything, and love is what binds us together across time and distance and even death. Remember and honor those memories by living fully, loving deeply, and never taking for granted the gift of the people in your life. There was not a dry eye when Xavier finished speaking. Emma hugged him fiercely, whispering, "Thank you, Papa. Thank you for everything." Other family members approached to share their own thanks and love, and Xavier felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection. Later, as the celebration continued into the evening, Xavier and Julia walked together up the hillside to Sarah's grave. The wooden cross had long since been replaced by a proper stone marker paid for by all the children together. The inscription read, "Sarah Wolf, beloved wife and mother, her love lives on." I come up here sometimes, Julia admitted, to talk to her, to thank her. I hope that's all right. More than all right, Xavier said. She brought us together. She's part of our story, part of our family. She always will be. Julia placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave, the same wildflowers that had bloomed here every summer for over 40 years. Thank you, Sarah, she said softly. Thank you for trusting me with your family. Thank you for Xavier. Thank you for giving me a life I never dreamed I could have. I've tried to honor your wishes, to be a good mother to Emma, to love Xavier the way he deserved to be loved. I hope I've done right by you, Xavier added his own words. You were right, Sarah, about everything. Julia was exactly who I needed, who Emma needed. You saw what I couldn't see, and you loved us enough to make me promise to find happiness again. I kept that promise, and it led me to the best years of my life. Thank you, my dear friend. Thank you for letting me go so I could find Julia. Thank you for Emma. Thank you for everything. They stood there for a while, 3 souls connected across time and death, bound by love and promises and the beautiful, messy business of being human. Then Xavier and Julia walked back down the hill hand in hand, to the cabin full of family, to the life they had built together from grief and hope and a dying woman's wisdom. Xavier Wolf lived to be 72 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1922 with Julia holding his hand. His funeral was attended by more than 100 people, all of them touched by his life in some way. He was buried next to Sarah on the hillside, and Julia made sure the inscription on his marker read, Xavier Wolf, beloved husband and father, a man who kept his promises. Julia lived another 8 years, spending her time surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She never remarried, saying that she had been blessed with one great love and that was enough for any lifetime. She divided her time between the mountain cabin and staying with various family members, always welcomed, always cherished. When Julia Donovan Wolf died in the spring of 1930 at the age of 76, she was laid to rest on the other side of Xavier. Her marker read, Julia Wolf, beloved wife and mother. She answered a dying woman's plea and found forever love. The 3 graves stood together on the hillside, a testament to love in all its forms, the love of a dying woman for her family, the love of 2 strangers who became soulmates, the love of a family that grew from impossible beginnings. Every summer, without fail, wildflowers bloomed around all 3 graves, as if nature itself was honoring the promises kept and the lives well lived. The cabin remained in the Wolf family for generations, each new occupant maintaining it with love and care, preserving the place where Xavier and Julia had built their life together. It became something of a family shrine, a place where Wolf descendants came to reconnect with their roots, to remember the story of how their family began. And the story was told again and again, passed down through the generations. The tale of a mountain man who made a promise to his dying wife, a lonely woman who took a chance on an unlikely proposal, and the love that grew from the ashes of grief. It became a family legend, a reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that promises mattered, that courage and grace could transform tragedy into triumph. Emma, who lived to be 93 years old, made sure the story was written down and preserved for future generations. She told it to her own grandchildren, and they told it to theirs, and the story of Xavier, Sarah, and Julia became part of the Wolf family heritage. Your great-great-grandfather was asked to do an impossible thing, Emma would say in her later years, her voice still strong despite her age. He was asked to open his broken heart and trust in a stranger, to believe that love could bloom again in the ruins of grief. And your great-great-grandmother Julia was asked to take a leap of faith, to marry a man she didn't know and become a mother to a child who wasn't hers. They were both so brave, braver than they probably ever realized. And because of their courage, all of you exist. Never forget that. Never take for granted the love that made your life possible. The story endured because it was true, because it spoke to something fundamental about the human capacity for love and resilience. It reminded people that grief did not have to be the end of the story, that new beginnings could grow from even the most painful endings, that promises made in love should be kept, even when they seemed impossible. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when they leave their earthly bodies, Sarah smiled. She had known, in those final moments of her life, that she was giving Xavier and Julia a gift. She had seen something in Julia's kind eyes that day at the boarding house, some spark of strength and gentleness that she recognized as exactly what her family would need. She had loved Xavier enough to let him go, to push him toward a future that would bring him happiness, even if she could not be part of it. Her promise me you'll marry her, had seemed cruel to Xavier at the time, an impossible burden laid on him in his moment of greatest grief. But it had been an act of profound love, a final gift from a woman who understood that love meant wanting happiness for those you loved, even if you could not be the source of that happiness. And Xavier had honored those last words forever, not just by marrying Julia, but by allowing himself to love again, to build a new life, to find joy in the midst of sorrow. He had taken Sarah's dying wish and transformed it into a legacy of love that would span generations. The mountain wind still blew through the pines around the old Wolf cabin. The wildflowers still bloomed each summer on the hillside, where 3 souls rested side by side. And the descendants of Xavier and Julia still gathered there, still told the story, still marveled at the unlikely beginning that had led to their existence. It was a love story for the ages, a tale of grief and grace, of promises kept and love found, of a dying woman's wisdom, and a mountain man who honored her words forever. It was a story that proved love could take many forms, that family was built on more than just blood, that the human heart was capable of infinite depths of feeling if only it was brave enough to try. And in the end, that was Sarah's true gift. Not just bringing Xavier and Julia together, but showing them both that love was worth the risk, that opening your heart again after loss was an act of courage, and that the best way to honor those we've lost is to keep living, keep loving, keep building something beautiful in their memory. The promise had been kept, the love had endured, and the story lived on, a testament to the power of love in all its forms, whispered through generations like the mountain wind through the pines, eternal and true.